Thank you. I talked about it, but I didn't hit the button. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay. All right. So, first off, the information shared today is not legal advice. Laws change. Facts are very specific, particularly with children and schools. And so this information shouldn't be relied on as legal advice. It's just information about the law and what is in federal education rights for students. If you're attending this conference with someone else and you haven't registered yet, or if you've just logged in because you've received the Zoom link, please register. We will send out information, this video link, once it's saved and converted to the YouTube site, we'll send out that link. Resources, other information will be sent out. We'll be taking a 10-minute break around noon today to address, and then after that, we'll come back and do some questions for about 5 minutes just to make sure we're all staying together. As time permits at the end of the training, I will be addressing more questions. Any questions you submit, you can send to Annabelle on the chat. We will save all of them. If we don't address them during this training, we will make time to address them afterwards through the email contacts that have gone out through the registration service, right? So if you register for the program, you'll get the response through the about any questions that were asked. Please note that this is a setting where we have, well, we're 83 people that have logged in so far, and we have people that will be watching the recording. Some of these people are parents, students, and then we have a lot of advocates and other people that are involved in the court system as well, like guardian ad litems. So if you enter in a question, please try to make it vague and not child specific if possible, just to try to add some confidentiality for the children that are involved with these cases. Okay, and then if you have any technical assistance questions, you can send Annabelle a chat or an email, and her email was on the communications that went out today. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'll be presenting today. My name is Laura Eisner. As I said, I work with the ELAP team. That's the Educational Advocacy Project. So I took this job about a year ago. Before that, I was a prosecutor. So I was did child protection, juvenile delinquency, some criminal cases for about 10 years. I wanted to switch, and this role was available. It's amazing. I love this work that I've done here. I guess one of the things that I did want to mention too is that I do have 4 kids. 2 of them, the older 2, are enrolled in public school. We have a little preschooler, and then my baby, or toddler, I guess he is now, he had a lot of medical issues when he was born, and so we have an IFSP with him. So we are invested in our public schools. We want our public schools to do well, and we have experience working with an IEP with my daughter. She has a speech IEP because she has troubles with her S blends like snow. And we have the IFSP with my little one. So we have some experience with this on our own and our family. And now I do this for my job. So, okay, just a little bit about SMRLS. SMRLS is a Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Service group. We're located in Southern Minnesota. Here's our service area. We have 9 office locations. Our educational law advocacy program services the whole area, though. We drive every which way to meet with clients and attend school meetings, or we can attend virtually, of course, too. Our client population is low-income folks that live in the service area or attend school in the service area. So if they live outside of the service area, but cross into a county that we serve, we can help them. SMRLS generally covers all sorts of law, right? They do family, housing, immigration, government benefits. A lot of people are aware of that, but they also have our education law program. So the education law program was developed to address the achievement gap. The achievement gap is the differences between educational achievement and outcomes of different marginalized groups. Minnesota was ranked recently as one of the worst, actually the worst in the nation for some of our achievement gaps. We're the worst in respect to college readiness exams, and we just have some very large achievement gaps between different races, ethnicity, socioeconomic statuses. Students who are at the most at risk are students with disabilities, students experience homelessness or in foster care, English learners, or students that are facing discrimination in the school. So we've helped with, and the reason I kept this on here is I just wanted to know people, if you had questions, you could reach out with some questions later on, but this is the stuff that we do help with. Pretty much it's anything in the school building. If there's struggles, we try to have a collaborative approach with the school to work out whatever struggles there are, or issues. We don't want to just blow up the relationship between the parents and the teachers or the staff. That doesn't help anybody, but we do go in there with all the tools ready to try to help our kids with academic performance. So if they're failing or not meeting what they're supposed to meet with graduation credits or reading skills, if there's troubles enrolling them, of course, IEPs, which we will cover today in depth, transportation, if there's any sort of maltreatment that happens in the school building. We've done a lot lately on harassment and bullying. That's really popped up as a big issue that parents have come forward with us about. Discrimination, any sort of school discipline and truancy issues that come up, and then of course English learner instruction. And then just so people are aware that if you do decide that you are a parent that has a need or are aware of people that have a need, after a case comes to us through our intake office, it's sent over to the education team and we'll work with the family to identify their objectives. We review the school records as well, which is helpful because sometimes the parents don't know everything that's going on. I had one family that called us and they were worried about like an online learning system or whatever tied to a suspension. And it turns out after we went through the file that the oldest child wasn't prepared to graduate. She didn't have enough credits and the parents didn't know that. So that was just something that we could help with in addition to their other concerns. Often we're involved in negotiations with a school attorney or school staff. We attend IEP meetings, we mediate. If needed, depending on the situation, and we're not successful in these other paths, we can do complaints, represent clients at administrative hearings, which we'll talk about all that stuff. That's at session 4, kind of the dispute resolution options. Okay, so today we're going to learn special education terminology, timelines, common acronyms. We're going to talk about the evaluation process, what should be in the development of an IEP, how your evaluation should shape your IEP documents, and kind of what's in the different sections of the IEP documents and what can be included. So it's a lot, and we will get through this together. All right, first things first, IDEA. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is the federal law that says special ed kids get services, right? So I have the 6 principles of IDEA. This is pulled directly from the law. So students are given public education at no cost that's appropriate to that individual student. All of that sentence or that section goes to the, I guess, acronym FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education. So students with disabilities are granted that, and that will come up a couple of times here, again, when we talk about some of the behavioral stuff in another session. FAPE is something that's really important and a consideration that needs to be taken whenever working with a child with a disability. Okay, and the principles of IDEA, of course, is to have appropriate evaluation. This is from the federal law that they have to determine if the student qualifies under IDEA as a child with a disability, and they're supposed to evaluate all areas of suspected disability. So we'll come back to this in a few minutes here, but it's comprehensive, right? It needs to be a full, detailed, comprehensive evaluation that will help us understand what the struggles are for that child and not just focus on one tiny piece of what someone might think is a concern. There needs to be a full wraparound of evaluation for that child. Okay, so the IEP is the individual education program. Often it's called the plan, right? That's just like common statement. But it is technically a program, right? It's supposed to be like an educational program for that child. And so when you look at the documents, and we'll go through this today, but when we look at the documents that are part of your IEP, really we need to look at it as a program, right? Each piece of this should match other sides of the document, other sides of your program to make sure that it's fully working and that all the services are in place. And then we'll talk about transition skills briefly today as well. The student should be in the least restrictive environment as possible. So they need to be as spending as much time as possible with non-disabled peers. And the parents have the right to be involved and participate in decision-making. They need to be invited to meetings. So that is a key requirement in the development of the statute. And then finally, the procedural safeguards. There are certain times when these have to go out to families, but there are always, they're posted on MDE, Minnesota Department of Education's website, and there is, parents can request them at any point to get those procedural safeguards. And it's a summary of what the parents' rights are under IDEA. Okay, so I'm just going to cover a couple different differences between how these IEP can kind of intersect with other options. We'll go into 504 plans in more detail in at the end of the training today, but I wanted to just highlight these to start out with to make sure we're all on the same page when we go forward. So IFSP, Individual Family Service Plan, that's children birth to 3. So the school district's coming into your house, giving you services, and it's more driven by priorities or concerns that the family has about a particular developmental disability. So the plan can include many different things. So vision, hearing, gross motor, fine motor, communication, and the plan only lasts until the child is 3, birth date 3. Even if you're like, well, they're not really biologically or developmentally 3, that doesn't matter. Birth date 3, then you move over to an IEP. Now, both of them start with an evaluation. The IFSP and an IEP would start with an evaluation. The team members would be different. And your IEP has measurable goals for academic, functional, behavioral, aspects of that child's educational life. The IFSP has major outcomes desired for the child. So I'm going to give an example from my situation, right? My little toddler has an IFSP, right? And so we're trying to work on helping him stand up and just, kind of shuffle his feet more, right? Instead of just being in one spot. And so that would be maybe a major outcome that we would want to have listed out instead of, a goal necessarily that they are going to have for him, but a major outcome. So we would have OT, PT types of services come into our house to try to work with us and him, of course, on strategies on how to help him build those strengths and navigate that developmental delay that he has. PACER, they are an organization in Minnesota here that helps advocate for families as well. They have an excellent chart on this, and that's linked in here so when I send out the slides, you can have that. Okay. Some of the questions that were submitted in the registration form, some of them were like, what's the differences between an IEP and a 504 plan? We will cover this extensively, but I just want to give a brief overview now so that everybody is on the same page. IEP is written for the student's special education and related services. They might have behavior or crisis planning supports. They have to have a disability that's listed under IDEA. So IDEA has 13 categories that they can fall under for eligibility. The disability must affect the child's educational performance. And then once we have all these things, then we have an IEP that's created, and now we need to have specialized instruction to make sure we're actually making progress and meeting our goals in school. Okay, so the 504 plan, on the other hand, is really more of a civil rights statute, right? So if we think of it as how do we think about how we get someone to have equal access to school, we can be more flexible, but there's not as much criteria, right? We don't have a giant federal law of IDEA behind the 504 plan. We have more of we need to help people with disabilities access their education. So if the child has a disability that is impacting their education and that the disability meets certain criteria, which we'll go through again here in a minute, but then that would be where we would have a 504 plan meeting, we talk to the school and try to see what we could do to remove some barriers for that child with a disability. 504 plans are, in my experience, easier to get in place than an IEP. IEPs take longer. And so sometimes 504 plans are a nice bridge to have from when you have a child that needs services, but you can't get an IEP done right away because it takes time to gather information and do all the evaluation pieces. A 504 plan might offer that services so you don't just have a child floundering in school while you wait to get that IEP completed or that IEP evaluation completed. Okay, just some other key definitions to cover. We talk about comprehensive evaluation. We'll go through this in a lot of detail today, but it's supposed to cover all areas of suspected disability. It's the start of an IEP, but it doesn't have to mean that it's going to end in an IEP. You can have a comprehensive evaluation that says the child doesn't qualify. And then parents can, there are options, I should say, if a parent does disagree with an evaluation that's done, that they can ask for another private evaluation that's called an IEE, or an independent educational evaluation. All right, functional behavioral assessment. So this should be part of your comprehensive evaluation. It should be lumped in there as part of that whole, like just an extra assessment. You do an assessment on hearing and vision. We're also going to do a functional behavioral assessment. It should be all part of your comprehensive evaluation. But sometimes you can have a functional behavioral assessment that's done separately or like on its own. That would be done in a way where you would have a person at the school look over if a child's disability sometimes manifests itself in a negative or harmful behavior at school, and it's impacting their education. And this is something that we'll talk about later today, and also in a couple other sessions as well. All right, prior written notice. This is key. This is like a really important document for everybody to be aware of, both school staff, social workers, guardian items, parents. Prior written notice is how the communication between a parent's request and a school's acceptance or refusal is being documented. So prior written notice is kind of a phrase that's doesn't really make any sense. So just, we call it PWN as an acronym, but just consider it a written notice, right? Kind of get rid of that prior. So a written notice that documents, okay, mom asked for OT services. We want occupational services in the school. So mom asked for that at the IEP meeting, and the school is going to refuse that. They need to document that in the PWN and send it to the parent. Or if they agree, they write that in the PWN, and then they would have to also modify the IEP and send that to the parent. So it's just a nice way to have everything communicated in writing so everyone knows what's going on. The content of this PWN should have why the school, I have agency, but that, I guess that's the language of idea, but it's the school, right? Why the school is accepting or refusing to do something, and details about that. We think we don't need OT because the child's fine, or we do need OT because we're seeing struggles with handwriting, whatever. Description of the evaluation or report or anything that they use to make that decision. Maybe they got an outside letter from a different doctor that said that the child really needs this supports in school and out. They can rely on that. Or if there's an evaluation that was done by the parent, private, or maybe the school got someone to come in and test them, and then they determined that it wasn't needed. A statement that the parent of the child has protections under the procedural safeguards. And then basically they need to have a section that's what the last page of your PWN, where it says, does the parent, are they going to agree or consent to what the school says in this paperwork, that they're refusing the parent's request? Does the parent agree to this or not? And why? If the parent disagrees, they can list why and then sign and date it. A PWN is very important. We'll go through many times throughout these trainings, but I just want to make sure we all have these definitions going forward. Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts here. The evaluation process for an IEP. Here's our flow chart. Start with identification. We'll go through each of these aspects, and then this little blue bubble is over here because you can come to this blue bubble or the IEE request many different ways, and that would have been way too many arrows to keep my flow chart understandable. So first things, we need to have an identification. School districts must identify, locate, and evaluate all children with disabilities who may need special education services. This is sometimes abbreviated as child find, and so they must identify them. Now, if they identify them, but they think there might be a service in place where they don't need to necessarily have a full IEP evaluation, but they want to do an intervention or reading supports or whatever the school calls it, it's not that's not excluded. Like, that can be an option, but when the child is identified, school needs to be communicating with the parent or guardian or whoever is making the educational decisions for that child about, we've identified this child, and we are proposing that instead of doing maybe an IEP evaluation right now, we are going to do, reading intervention services for a while and see how that goes. Now, the parent doesn't have to agree, but that should be communicated because we need to have that child find identification piece done. So, and parents can identify, right? Or if the child's living with the grandparent go into the school and say, I know my child has a diagnosis of ADHD and is really struggling with the last school. He's now living with me. I need an evaluation done. That would count to start the process here. Okay, so after someone is identified, a student's identified, and we decide that we need to have an evaluation request, whether the school's requesting it or the parents requesting it, grandparent, whoever, someone's requesting an evaluation, right? Okay, so the evaluation request is made up in writing. It doesn't have to be, but it's recommended just to keep everything organized for everybody. That's why we got the PWN law in place that really helped everybody stay organized. So if a evaluation request made in writing, follow up if necessary, just to make sure things are moving. Okay. So they would meet with key people within the school about the evaluation request. So I go to my child's school at the conference. I say, hey, I'm really worried about my son. I think he might have some learning disabilities based on what we're seeing for his reading. I want to have an IEP evaluation done. Then we'll set up a meeting, not with a whole team because we don't know who he's going to be part of that team yet, but with the special education director, maybe his general education teacher, maybe he's doing reading intervention already, so that person can come, that teacher can come. So some key members of the school can show up for that meeting. Parents will attend the meeting. They can bring their, invite school staff. They can reach out to people that have been helpful in identifying or working with their child. Parents can ask for support people to come, a parent advocate or attorney, or if they have, their, the grandparent is really good at like organizing and the mom, is juggling a child with a disability, they can bring support people. And then of course the students can come as well, right? So that's something to keep in mind, that parents can invite other people outside of just the school staff. Parents can provide key documents ahead of the meeting. They can bring copies to the meeting. So if they have evaluations that were done outside, they went to a reading clinic this summer and they had an evaluation, they want to bring that forward. That's something that they can provide to help everybody make decisions at this meeting. So this meeting typically is called like a pre-evaluation meeting or pre-evaluation conference. And then we would talk with everybody, the school staff, parents, everybody would work to identify what concerns do we have about the child's learning. Is it behavioral? Is it sensory, academic, developmental, functional, physical? There's some other things that can sometimes come out sideways as, maybe my child can't read, but and they're struggling academically, but they're also every time they're asked to read, they go and punch the teacher in the face, right? So we have some other things that are going on that we need to have an evaluation on for everything. And so then we would have a discussion about what we need to have covered in our comprehensive evaluation. All right, so after we identify the concerns, then we have to identify how are we going to collect that data? Are we going to use specific tools? This is like behavioral something skills. I don't remember what it's, BOSC 3. It's like a very lengthy, peer-reviewed assessment for a child, right? Do we have that? Or do we just have that the child's going to be interviewed and have them observed? How do we know how the data is going to be collected is we're just having this discussion, and then we need to make sure that we get it in the PWN so that we can agree with it. Okay, so after this meeting, you have the discussion with the school, you say, this is my concerns, here's a report from my private, doctor that says that they have concerns. We want to have everything done through peer-reviewed assessments. You have your conversation with the school, and the school, maybe they are also have concerns about something else that they'll talk about. So everything then is collected from this kind of brainstorming meeting and put into a PWN, that prior written notice, and they'll send it to the parent for review. Now, if it's an initial evaluation, if it's the first time that child has been identified as needing help, or if there hasn't been any sort of evaluation or IEP or services in place for a year, the parent has to consent. Otherwise, the school won't move on the evaluation. After that, and we'll go into reevaluations in a few minutes here, but after that, reevaluations, they will occur if the parent doesn't say that they object. So if the parent doesn't do anything on a reevaluation, the stuff will just start and move forward without them. Okay, so here we have our identification. We had our pre-evaluation meeting, and now we are going to go forward with our initial comprehensive evaluation. This is an evaluation, well, we kind of talked about that before, but the evaluation must be completed within 30 school days after the school receives permission. This is a Minnesota statute or law that requires that permission. That permission is the parents returning a PWN that's been signed, right? I consent to evaluation, return it to the school. That is the permission for the school to start it, and it's 30 school days. So if you say that you want to have that started at the beginning of June, well, you're going to wait until September to have it finished because it's the school day count or calendar. Okay. And just because an evaluation is done doesn't mean that an IEP is going to be developed. It could potentially be that the child doesn't qualify for IEP services. So just want to make sure that everyone's remember that. So, okay. So comprehensive evaluations, they use a variety of tools to do the assessments and strategies. They look at different aspects of that child, right? They shouldn't use, like we talked about, they shouldn't use just one sole criteria for determining if a child is a student with a disability or determining what the appropriate education is for that student. Also, they need to use technically sound instruments unless there's some sort of agreement that it would be something otherwise, but technically sound instruments are within the statute for assessing the child. Okay, so this is an example of one of my cases. We had, this was an initial evaluation. So it says the district will not begin the evaluation without your written consent, right? So if parent wouldn't have sent anything in, nothing would have happened. We would have just stopped and they would not have done an evaluation. Okay, so they sent this to us after our discussion. They're going to review records on all these things. They're going to do observations by these people. They have other here, and it has parent input, assistive technology. So we had concerns, the parent and I, when we reviewed this, because what are the observations for? Like, to what end are we gathering information and data here? So we objected to that. We said that we wanted to have some more clarity on other aspects. And so we objected to this thing, and I'll show you the next page here just so you can see. So this is the objection. So this is what your last page of your PWN would look like, right? And it says, check one of the boxes to indicate your response to the proposed or refused action. And so consent would be, I agree to the school district proceeding with the proposed or refused action. So here they proposed that they were going to do the initial evaluation, right? So the parent could have consented, and she would have had to consent for the initial, otherwise nothing happens. Or we could object and ask for a meeting, a conciliation conference, or a meeting with the IEP team. We'll go into conciliation conference on series 4 of the training. So we objected, we just asked for a meeting with the IEP team, and we just said, that some of this is not clear as to what's happening. Why are you getting parent input on other, what are the observations for? So after we objected, we got a new PW1 that was, had some changes. So instead of just saying other here, right, we now have assistive technology, and we're going to have parent input, student environment, task tools, and set. That's like an assessment type thing, right? So they're going to have that. They moved all of our observations into the sections, so we actually know what area that the special education teacher would be doing an observation for. Academic performance. The school psychologist is going to look for social emotional behavior when they do their observation. So all of those things were reorganized, so at least we understood what people were doing, because we need to know when we get that comprehensive evaluation completed, did everybody do their part, and what were they looking for, right? If I don't know what the school psychologist is going in there to begin with, if they come back with some other report, I don't know what, how to clarify that or ask questions about that. But now we know for sure they're doing the social emotional behavioral component. Okay, so then this was on the first part of that PWN that came back with that information, and they listed what they changed. So in response to the parents' request for revision to the initial evaluation, PWN, they made these changes. And so they listed actually everything that they tweaked for us because of what our concerns were, which was nice. So the parent was very clear on kind of the back and forth conversation that we had, and the PWN captured everything in all of our discussions. So she consented, and then the initial evaluation started. Okay, I'm just going to touch base real quick on two other types of evaluations because we're kind of talking about evaluations. But our flow chart is, it just is a unique way to set up. So we'll cover everything on this. I just want to make sure that you know that it's not exactly, you don't do a comprehensive evaluation and then do a reevaluation. But since we're talking about evaluations, I wanted to touch on these. So we do our comprehensive evaluation. And so we do a comprehensive evaluation, child qualifies, we have an IEP. Over here, we do a reevaluation. Now we're supposed to do a reevaluation at least every 3 years, okay? So this, the reevaluation statute is a little loosey because if it doesn't have to be done every 3 years because the parent can ask for it or the school can recommend it after 1 year, right? It's supposed to be done every 3 years, but it can be done earlier. Also, the parent, and if the parent and school agree together, they can agree to not do it every 3 years. So if you have a student that's maybe close to graduating and he's up for a reevaluation, maybe the parent and the student and the parent, student, and the school all agree that a reevaluation is not really needed because we're going to graduate, you know, in 6 months. If that's done for the school and the parent, you typically want to sign something just to make sure everything's clear on that, but that is a path that's available. So, okay. So it's important to document requests, agreements, disagreements. Again, I put in the language that it shouldn't occur more than once a year, unless you guys agree, school and parent agree. It shouldn't occur, it should be within that 3-year time, unless the school and parent agree and they want it, you know, at 2nd year mark or whatnot. And then it doesn't even have to happen at the 3-year mark unless they agree. So it's a little loose on this language here, but reevaluations, nevertheless, always should be comprehensive. So it's possible you can say we want a reevaluation, but we want it just a review of existing data, but the data review should still be discussed in the evaluation meeting, outlined in the PWN, and parents and schools should agree that the work that they're doing is comprehensive for that student. Okay, now reevaluations do not require that PWN to start. So if parent has sent a PWN after that meeting and they're like, oh, I don't know if we want to do a reevaluation yet, or, you know, I want to include other assessments in it. The parent needs to object, and they have to object within 14 days. Otherwise, that the reevaluation will start. And if the parent can agree, right, they can consent, and they can consent right away, and then the reevaluation would start immediately. So, but the failure to respond within 14 days can cause some issues, and so it's really important to read through your PWNs and make sure that those are properly documented, however you're moving forward. Okay, and then the evaluation report must include a summary of all evaluation results. And then I just put a note here briefly, the functional behavioral assessment, I told you sometimes those are done standalone or by themselves without being included in the comprehensive evaluation. If you ask for a comprehensive evaluation, and you're seeing some behavioral struggles, coping struggles, self-regulation, you might want to have a functional behavioral assessment done, included in that comprehensive evaluation, right? That would make it fully comprehensive. But the functional behavioral assessment also it can be done on its own. It's not considered a reevaluation though, it's considered an assessment. And so if a functional behavioral assessment is being proposed by the school, the parent can ask for a full comprehensive evaluation, just to say like, okay, well, yeah, I see the concerns or behaviors that you're saying. I do think a functional behavioral assessment is needed, but I also want to look at other things too, because we're seeing changes academically, peer-wise, whatever, you know, they're really struggling to, you know, finish assignments, whatever the concerns are. All of those things can be lumped into the comprehensive if you want to have a full look at it. And there's a case in another state, but there's a case that said that the functional behavioral assessment is because it is considered an assessment, the parents don't have as much rights around it if they disagree with the functional behavioral assessment. Okay, so examples of when you might want to consider when someone might want to consider reevaluation, whether it's a school, social worker, parent, whoever. So if you have an evaluation to see if the student's disability category has changed, to see if they qualify under new and additional disability categories, maybe there's new service needs that the child needs and they're not quite certain what that would be. So having a reevaluation done could help with that. If 12 months has elapsed since the child has received special education and there's a request to do an evaluation, that would be considered an initial. So if you haven't had special education services for a student for 12 months and you want to start that back up again, you're starting the process again with an initial evaluation, which also means the parent needs to consent for this to start. Okay, so also an evaluation topic, the independent educational evaluation, that's IEE, that's our blue bubble. So our blue bubble doesn't have any lines to it because when there's a point where a parent disagrees with the school evaluation being comprehensive or properly addressing that child's needs, they can ask for the IEE. So the parent has a right to request an independent educational evaluation. This is done at the school's expense or public expense if they disagree with an evaluation done by that agency or that school, I should say. So if the parent requests the IEE, the school can ask why. Why do you want to have an IEE? Why do you object to our evaluation? The parent doesn't have to tell them though. So, but the school has to respond. If the parent makes a request for an IEE, so say for example, the parent got a reevaluation, they look through it and they're like, this just doesn't match up with what I'm seeing from at home. His general education teachers are not saying this, that this reevaluation doesn't match with my understanding of my child. I want to ask for an IEE. The school needs to do one of two things. They either arrange to pay for that IEE and work with the parent on planning that out, or they have to file a due process complaint with the Office of Administrative Hearings. And again, we're going to go through dispute resolution stuff at the 4th series, but there is 2 routes that go this way, and one of them has to happen. It cannot be not doing anything. So, if the school does go with the Office of Administrative Hearings, the parent can present information. Again, we'll go through all of this, but I left it in here just so that the slides are all comprehensive, just in case you had questions. The hearing officer for that administrative hearing can also request an IEE too, so that's also a possibility. Okay, so how to read a comprehensive evaluation. First, I'll note that evaluations are all written differently, but I thought I'd put this in here to try to help make it a little bit easier moving forward. Okay, so at minimum, the evaluation must include a summary of all evaluation results. It must document if the student has a particular category of disability or continues to have a disability. So if you have a reevaluation, they say they continue to be qualified under the autism or other health disabilities. They need to have the present level of performance and educational needs that derive from this disability needs to be in this evaluation. Whether the child needs special education and related services or continues to need those if it's a reevaluation. If there are any additions or modifications to the special education plan and related services that would help meet the measurable goals in that IEP program, so the individualized education program. So what do we need to do to add in to make sure that that child's general education curriculum is basically obtainable? Like, how could they participate in general education curriculum with their peers and continue to learn on the pathway of the peers? What do we need to do? Do we need to have maybe a note taker or have everything that the teacher says for an assignment written down as well as stated verbally? What do we need to do to help them be successful in general education? All right, so common sections in a comprehensive evaluation. We're going to touch a little bit about this before, about what to hopefully find in it, but we need to have it broken down because some of these evaluations, get to 30 some pages, right? So we have the reason for the evaluation, background information, strengths and concerns that are reported by the parents, present level of academic achievement and functional performance, and annoyingly, that's an acronym is PLAF. So but that needs to be in there, right? And then what are we looking at? What did we do for when we had our pre-evaluation meeting and we talked about all of our concerns for our child, what did we identify as what needed to be evaluated in that comprehensive evaluation? Academic, intellectual, cognitive, developmental, behavioral, physical, functional. Those are other things that are there that we need to make sure we're fully evaluated and covered. So these are typically these comprehensive evaluations have headers above each one for this testing section, the academic, intellectual, cognitive, etc. section, and then you would have within them more details, of course, but they try to lump all the information together so it's easier to read. So sections are usually grouped together based on topics. They should include summaries of the tools, who completed it and when. And they should also include data, information that was collected from school staff. Did they observe the parents? What are the implications of what they gathered on the education of that child? All of that should be in your evaluation. So here's just a little blip. So intellectual heading, right? And then we might have like our Kaufman assessment battery for children, like that's what they did, right? And then the person that administered it and when they did it, and then I didn't put it because it would be like a page and a half, but like summary, data, results, educational implications, right? And then we would go to academic, and our academic would be maybe instead of doing testing, our teacher wanted to do a review of educational records, and we agreed with that. And so that would be something here. They'd list that, who was done by, when, and then they would list out their summaries here, include any reports that they gathered from the parent or the classroom, and they should indicate what the educational implications of their findings are so that we know how to use their report. Okay, so here's an example, right? So we have autism spectrum rating scale, right? It was administered by a school psychologist. And so it just has a little summary here about what they did. They used this assessment. This is what it means, or how to read it. Although some of it kind of can go over people's heads a little bit. I mean, T-scores is sometimes a little complex for me. But it should have a summary here about what people are doing with the assessments and what they've gathered. Then they have their data here, right? So and then the evaluation included interpretation of the assessment and then the educational implications. So we have a breakdown, and this was assessment that was done very nicely where we had a lot of sections divided up so we could easily follow what they were doing. It wasn't just all lumped together in one long, extensive list. So, okay, all right, I want to touch a little bit more on the functional behavioral assessment piece here. Okay, so depending on your suspected disability, during the initial evaluation, the school district should conduct a functional behavioral assessment. The comprehensive evaluation, you have your intellectual, you have your academic, you have your developmental or physical. You should also have a functional behavioral assessment. If there's any sort of concerns about regulation, coping, and I'm not to say that this is an end all be all perfect system by any means, but it is a way to gather more information to see what's actually going on in the school, if there are behavioral concerns or regulation concerns, coping concerns in the school building. Or if the child has trauma history or emotional behavioral concerns, this would be a good way to try to capture what's going on that potentially could lead them to have struggles in the building. Okay, so this is drawn from Minnesota statute. The Minnesota statute defines what needs to be in a functional behavioral assessment. So it would include a description of the problem behaviors, identification of times, events, and situations that would predict the occurrence or non-occurrence of behaviors. So the child is fine during lunch and gym, but has struggles during math, that would be at least something to note. Maybe it's a sensory issue, maybe it's because the math homework's really hard, or it could be just because, you know, maybe the child does better at running and being with more free flow, right? Whatever it is, that's a good thing to know. We need to know what's going on when. There should also be an identification of antecedents, consequences, reinforcers that we're seeing around this behavior. So is it every time that we ask the child to do multiplication that they have a concern? You know, maybe it's a behavioral response because they're feeling overwhelmed with math. Or is every time we say we're going to go to lunch, the child kicks the garbage can? Is it, you know, maybe they're mad that their mom didn't pack them lunch, whatever, right? So we have the antecedent here that we need to know what that is, and try to at least identify it. Sometimes it's hard, I know, but it's something that needs to be included in the functional behavioral assessment. And then they should also use variety of data collection methods. So, and come up with a hypothesis. Why do we think that this behavior is happening, or self-regulation struggles are happening? You know, is there some sort of pattern that we can see when we are working with this child? Okay, so your functional behavioral assessment, again, which should be in your comprehensive evaluation, typically is outlined with a number of different headers. Not all the time, though. These are assessments that are done by many different people, so everybody does it their own way, but this is something that I've seen on a regular behavior. So a regular instance with patterns with the staff that do these. Description of behaviors, description of events, right? Kind of going through the statute, description of apparent functions of the behavior. And they should list possible replacement behaviors. Like, what do we have in mind to help the child be successful instead of kicking the garbage can? Are there positive behavioral interventions in place and support strategies that we can use? What have they been effective? Maybe doing a reward system doesn't help our child because they don't understand rewards. They just don't get that why they're missing out on something. Instead, we need to have something else in place that would be helpful to help the child understand or take next steps. A description of changes in the environment. So maybe reducing noise, sensory input, and yeah, just summary, they need to have their hypothesis about what they think the purpose of the behaviors are, so that the child, if we know why the child's doing certain things, or at least have a hypothesis about why they're doing certain things, we can try to work with them on that. And we can figure out if it's not working, we can try something else. If it is working, then we can continue to build on that. But if we have no hypothesis or no summary statements about why a child is doing a certain thing, it's very difficult for the staff to continue to work with the child, and often the frustration builds up. So all of this does go to the fact that I guess some kids will have behavioral responses in school. All of this is tied to their disability, though. So whether it's considered they just don't have the coping strategies necessary, or our coping strategies don't work for them and they need to develop their own, this is all connected to how we see their disability in times of stress, right? And so the purpose of this and the goal of functional behavioral assessment is to gather this information so that we can help build a plan that would help support the child. And maybe it starts out slow. Maybe the plan would be slower. We would have, they just need a break, or a fidget spinner, or some sort of sensory room to go to that they like. Maybe they need to talk to their favorite teacher for a moment, or take a walk outside, go to the gym, right? So the purpose of this is to design something in place that would help the child baby step their way into having replacement behaviors at the school. And it's not to say the child's going to be perfect, right? I mean, no one's perfect, right? Everybody has their bad days, but it should be a tool to help our kids be successful if they really are struggling. And staff is struggling to manage behaviors, and we're seeing, disciplinary actions, suspensions, things like that in place. So anyways, that's the functional behavioral assessment. Okay, so I think we should take our 10-minute break now, and we'll come back for some questions, and then we're going to jump into eligibility. So I will just give everybody let's see, I don't even have, what time is it? So we'll come back at like, should we say 12 o'clock or thereabouts? And we'll do a couple questions before we go on. Does that sound good? Okay, thank you all. Okay, so we're back here. We can do questions for a little bit and then continue on. So Annabelle, I think some people submitted questions too.
Yes. So the first one we have is, can a school refuse to take action regarding evaluation or providing services? Can their refusal be related to the school's lack of funding or capacity to staff?
No, they can't. Department of Education's been really clear on that. Now, I mean, I don't know how to make people disappear out of, thin air, but having conversations with the school about, desires about how to move forward, service needs is going to be key, but they can't just refuse outright for lack of funding or lack of staff capacity.
Okay, great. And then another question we got was, whose responsibility is it to actually write the IEP? Which is there specific staff members that have to write it, or?
So typically it falls on the case manager to write it. But I've been to lots of IEP meetings where we just sit there as a team and it's up on the screen and we all kind of write it together or work on it together. But yeah, often it's most commonly it is the case manager that will write it and then send it to people. So.
Okay, great. Those are the only two we had so far. And just a reminder, if anyone does have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I will note them for the end of the presentation today.
All right, thank you, Annabelle. Okay, so. Okay, so let's go. We're gonna do eligibility considerations. Okay, so this would be a beast and we don't have time for that. So I'm just gonna give some highlights of this section, but honestly, for each one of these eligibility categories, I probably could do like 6 hours training just on that alone. So, all right, so under IDEA, there are 13 eligibility criteria for disabilities that would qualify a child to have an IEP. So specific learning disability, other health impairment, autism spectrum disorder, emotional disturbance, visual impairment, deafness, speech and language impairment, hearing impairment, deaf blindness, orthopedic impairment, intellectual disability, traumatic brain injury, and multiple disabilities. And multiple disabilities does not include deaf blindness. So it would actually technically be 3, I guess, if you had deaf blindness plus something else. But so I'm going to highlight a couple of these that are not clear just in the labeling of them. But again, just know that all of these are a lot, and I just want to give you enough so that you can move forward with some of this information. Okay, under IDEA, there is a thing called emotional disturbance, and that's the phrase that they use in the federal statute. And these are the things that can qualify a child for emotional disturbance. So a condition marking one or more of the following characteristics over a long period of time. So inability to learn that can't be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. They have a struggle or inability to build and maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with teachers or peers, inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings, a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, and a tendency to develop or a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personnel or school problems. So if they had one of these things, that could qualify them for emotional disturbance. And the federal law says that this would include schizophrenia. So, and then Minnesota has a rule that defines, it's actually labeled as emotional or behavioral disorders. And so we have in Minnesota, our rules on these, some of these disabilities are extensive on the definition and then also how to qualify. So emotional disturbance here in Minnesota has a lot of the same language. It's just phrased a little bit tiny differently. So a pattern of one or more of the following emotional or behavioral responses, and then it's kind of a lot of the same stuff, withdrawal, anxiety, depression, or disordered thought processes with unusual behavior patterns or atypical communication styles, aggression, hyperactivity, impulsivity. So the established pattern of emotional or behavioral responses must adversely affect the educational and developmental performance of that student, and be significantly different than other age-appropriate cultural ethnic norms. So if we have a middle school child that's a little grumpy, they're not going to maybe necessarily qualify for emotional disturbance. But if they are depressed, really feeling, worthless, a lot of anxiety with going to school, that's above and beyond their typical peers, right? Then that student may qualify under emotional disturbance. So, and they also include under the rule how to kind of categorize this and look at it. So you'll have to go to the rule if you're interested in how the assessment's done, or we can have another long training on it, but it won't be today. All right, so just some things to consider for that one. Okay, other health impairment. This is the federal law, right? Other health impairment means there's some sort of acute or chronic health problems such as asthma, ADHD, rheumatic fever, sickle cell anemia, Tourette syndrome, and it adversely affects the child's academic performance. If the child has diabetes and it doesn't impact their academic performance, then they wouldn't qualify, right? So we would need to have this connection. So Minnesota also has this, and the rules down here at the bottom. They call it other health disability instead of impairment, so that is slightly different. And they talk about just the impact that this disability has to their strength, endurance, alertness, environmental stimuli, whatnot, right? So all of those things, and if you have a written note or something that would look like ADHD or diagnosis of ADHD, then they would cover under the other health disability. So I had a young client that had some medical issues and an implant of sorts, and that actually impacted her alertness and endurance to be in school, like just ability to sit through class for a long period of time. And so that was a way that we got her categorized under her IEP was other health disability because of this medical issue she had. And we got a note from the doctor that just explained this kind of unique situation and how it looked when she was struggling with things. So, all right, specific learning disability under IDEA. Specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes that involve understanding or using language spoken or written. Now, it can manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. So dyslexia commonly falls within this. Different types of reading struggles can fall in this possibly. Brain injury, if there's some sort of minimal brain dysfunction, all of those things, if it's kind of falling within this language aspect or communication aspect. So, but it doesn't, it would not include learning problems that are primarily the result of hearing, vision, or motor disabilities, right? So there's all these things that would like rule it out. So if you are struggling with understanding or using language, spoken or written, because you're deaf, obviously they have here this language, this is learning disability eligibility wouldn't apply, right? Because it doesn't apply for hearing folks or hard of hearing folks. So, all right. So this is the Minnesota one. It has a lot. And the statute's very long, or the rule's very long. But this is kind of similar language up here. So this is section, oops, excuse me, sorry. The top section is very similar to the IDEA law, but the bottom section is different. And that's why I wanted to plug this in and just kind of show that Minnesota does take what IDEAS has and offers more information or more guidance as to how to look into these disabilities. So the disorder is manifested by interference with organizing or storing information, right? Like, I mean, it has like all these examples of how it could really impact the child when it comes to that. So, or if the, they can't retrieve the information. So maybe they hear everything, but they can't like understand, like gather it and like be able to share it with anybody. And then of course that would impact them, because if you can't, you know, share the information or retrieve information that you've learned, that would impact their academic functioning. So Minnesota, this is Minnesota rule. The links or the information's down here how to find this, but this is a much more detailed and has more explanation as to what is considered in this type of disability criteria. All right, autism under IDEA is the developmental disability significantly affecting verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction. It's generally evident before age 3, but that's really not a requirement under IDEA. There's a paragraph underneath all this that says it can be shown after 3. And that adversely affects a child's educational performance. And they talk about other characteristics that might be considered. And then here again, this is the rule for Minnesota. Talks a little bit more about the core features that might be through the spectrum from mild to severe. Some considerations for that. Autism, the rule, Minnesota rule has a lengthy explanation about how to assess for criteria to qualify under the autism spectrum disability. And then also they have a requirement in Minnesota where it's supposed to have a child with autism spectrum diagnosis as a disability criteria, and the IEP should have someone that's some sort of consultant on autism on the IEP team. And that can look different in many different forms. Like maybe if a teacher just has a certificate or something in it, maybe that would qualify. It's not really specific in the rule, at least on like how to meet that, but that is in the rule that should be something to consider when you're putting together your IEP team. Okay, so short and sweet. I didn't cover everything. There's no way I could, but I just wanted to make sure that you had some information, at least know where to go to look for things as you're trying to dive into eligibility criteria. Okay, so now we're going to develop our IEP, right? We had our identification, our child qualifies, so that's good news. Now we're going to go to our IEP development, okay? So when creating the IEP, our IEP team should consider the strengths of the students, concerns of the parents, result of our newest evaluation, which was initial evaluation, or it could have been the comprehensive, right? We need to gather that information. If it's a reevaluation, what's changed, what's improved, what's not, and the academic, developmental, functional needs of the child. So all of that is being considered, and that goes into our IEP development. All right, and so this is some of the stuff that should be included or must be included in your IEP development. We'll go through this in length, but I wanted to include it on the flowchart section too, so you would have that as a slide. Okay, so when developing your IEP, the IEP team must determine the strengths, all the concerns that are kind of going around the child's education. And then there's actually some particular rules about a couple of other specific type of disabilities that Minnesota has. It includes if there's behavior impeding the student's learning, that they should include a positive behavior interventions and supports to address that behavior. In the case of English learner, child that's learning English as a second language, they need to consider the language needs of that child in their IEP. So if they have an IEP for, maybe the child has a reading processing disorder, and then on top of it, they're also learning English as a second language. Like, how do we consider these needs of the student as an English learner and as a child with a disability in the IEP? And so that just is a requirement under Minnesota rule. There's also some other requirements for like if a child is blind, like do we need to offer them Braille or consider other services in place? So this statute's very good and has a lot of helpful information, or rule, excuse me, Minnesota rule. Okay, so the child's present level of academic achievement and functional performance, or PLAF, right? So how is this? This information should be coming from the comprehensive evaluation. We need to know where they're at presently. We're putting together this IEP today, August 3rd, and we're going to know exactly where that child is today. I don't want to have a bunch of information in there about how, 2 years ago, the kid didn't really want to, listen to the teachers or whatever. That does not help me right now. I want to have present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. So how is the child doing in school? Oh, like, and all of the categories, right? How is their disability and check their involvement in school, affect their involvement in school? What are the needs of the child? Do we have input from the parents or outside support? And one thing that I have found that's been beneficial is parents writing a parent input letter. And so that can be considered as well and added to the IEP just to make sure everything's kind of included. Or, you know, the guardian, maybe a grandparent has the child, so the grandpa can write a parent input letter that could go into the IEP to help support that child, just to give some more background on where they're at, and it could be added to the IEP to make the educational program more comprehensive or more thorough. So here's our PLAF acronym. There's a couple of things that need to be described when we are considering this. For preschool kids, we have to describe how the disability affects the child's participation in appropriate activities. Okay, when we get through K through 12, how the disability affects that child's involvement and progress in general curriculum. And then as an additional thing that needs to be added, once the students get to 9th and then above, right, 9th through 12, they need to have information on transition areas as well in present levels of performance. So we need to start thinking about how our kid in 9th grade is going to do, you know, college, community college, career, whatever that is, and start including that present level of performance in our PLAF. And maybe at 9th grade, we don't have an exact plan involved for the child, or the child doesn't know what they want to do, but it would probably be important that they know how to count money, right? Or make food, you know, that type of stuff. Like what are we doing to help them transition to be on their own? And that can be included in this area. Okay, so I just listed some of the stuff that we usually put in there, should be in there. We do summaries of past evaluations and assessments in this section as well. It does offer some help, but if it's not under that summary section and it's grouped into other sections. So if I have a summary here of like the past evaluation for functional behavioral assessment found that the child's coping skills were really poor, I want that under my summary of past evaluations and assessments so that I know that that's a past evaluation assessment and not lumped into something that's now, because we need to make sure we're making the best decisions and creating a plan that actually works for the child now. And maybe there's some good helpful tips from what happened before, but I want it at least in the right category or the right section, so it doesn't get confusing when we go through it. All right. Now our IEP should also have annual goals, right? What does our IEP team think about what can be accomplished this year, in a year? Now it doesn't have to be. IEPs don't have to be just for academics. We can cover regulation, functional skills, behavioral goals. It doesn't have to be just math and reading. We can do anything that the child really is struggling with to try to build them up and be successful. And the school districts have a responsibility to work with these children and help them be successful wherever they're struggling. So I had a client one time where he was struggling with two things. Actually, he was struggling with following multiple step directions, and he was having difficulty washing his hands. So the school created a functional skills goal with 8 steps to help him learn how to wash his hands and to help him follow step-by-step directions. So it was actually kind of a twofold goal, but it was really nice where they were working with him to help him build that skill. He's just a little guy, but he sometimes would forget to get the soap off or dry his hands off or whatever. And so we had the step-by-step goal with washing his hands. So we were building a functional skills goal of following step-by-step, but also functional skills of just learning to wash his hands and remembering to get soap off your hands. Does the child need to learn to ride a bike? And they do bike riding at, you know, with her non-disabled peers. Do we add that in and try to build that in a skill for her as she's working on her, you know, kind of physical therapy and physical skills at school? The child need help navigating peer relationships, reading at grade level. All of these things can be in an IEP, and it doesn't have to be just one or another. It should be a document that pulls in everything from your evaluation, your comprehensive evaluation, and help them build up on skills. Okay. Oh, and we're definitely going to go over goals. That's next week. A lot on goals next week. Okay. How to measure goals and how progress should be reported. Okay, so I have this green box. This is just a little snapshot from someone's IEP. How will progress towards meeting this annual goal be measured? So it was under goal number 1. And I have here student work samples will be used to measure progress towards this goal. Now, next week, we'll talk about why I had significant concerns about this, how this is going to be measured, because I don't even know who this is, who's going to gather it, what are work samples, how often is it going to be done? Like, I have nothing on this, but that will be next week. We at least have in the report or the IEP that progress that, we're going to gather some information. So at least we know that. And then progress reporting is usually on the first page of your IEPs. And it is typically under like the level section and above the IEP team. And they list how often progress reporting should happen. Progress will be reported to parent in written format 4 times a year, once per quarter, with 1 being the annual IEP plan or individual education plan. With technically rewriting an IEP isn't a progress report. So we'll talk about that next week, but that's at least we know how the discussion has happened about how they're going to share, working towards these goals, working towards the goal that had been outlined, or many goals that have been outlined in this IEP. Okay. It also should have special education and related services that's going to be provided to that child. So any changes to the program or supports for school staff, any supplemental aids or services that are needed, we need to have accommodation sections that should list what the school is providing. And so this section is really crucial for making sure that we are properly addressing our annual goals. And each one of these sections, it's all included in that IEP packet, right? But we need it, think of it as every document header is kind of its own document, right? And so anything that's in your accommodations, modifications, and support section should reflect somehow in the goals, or the goals, if they have some things that they need for the child to be successful, we need to have that in your accommodations, modifications, and support section. So it's it's almost like a Mobius strip where you keep going around and around because you need to just check all of the documents to make sure that that's correct and that everything matches within itself. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the service grid. So this is the question usually of how much school day the student will be in a separate classroom from non-disabled peers, and what does participation in extracurricular or non-academic activities look like? So these are the 2 things that we're asking. There's 2 bold things below, but they kind of reflect themselves in the service grid. So often we need to figure out like if our student is going to be like just a normal general education room all the time, so that'd be level 1, or are they going to be in a special education room all of the day? Do they get to go to lunch with their peers? Can they be on the football team? All of these conversations need to happen, and part of this section here where we outline the service grid would be a discussion about the hours of time for services, and then below that they usually list like other needs, like if we need a pair to help with transitions or supports to help them be on the football team, transportation, whatever that is, all of that kind of falls within this area. So I have this example here that I pulled. This is the service grid for a student that attended elementary school. So they list a couple other things about why they're offering different services, right? So we have social works services, right? So they're going to help the child build self-regulation and social interaction. And that's how often they're going to do it, is 30 minutes, 1 time a week. So, and then, we have, this is the indirect. So this would be more like if you have direct services, that's the staff working one-on-one with the student. Indirect would be maybe connecting with other staff, outside providers, talking to teachers, parents, right? And so they give themselves some times to do that. And that's outlined as here. And as a second box, that's often how I see that on the IEPs. Okay, down here, our student was offered a personal care assistant or a paraprofessional. It's non-one-on-one, so that was a question by the parent. Also, it said 1 time a day, but we didn't have any length of session compared to our other ones that have length of sessions. And so actually the parent objected to this IEP because 1 time a day is not clear as to what's actually being offered for their child to have a one-on-one a non-one-on-one para. And it's unclear as to what the supports are, what the school's even offering. And so that's something just to kind of consider when you're going through the service grid is what's the school offering? and what's, is the parent understanding that? Is the team on board with understanding what that means? It's just kind of it's a good discussion to have with the IEP team to make sure that everybody's talking about the same thing. All right, so another question for your IEP is whether or not the child should participate in statewide assessments, and if so, what modifications are needed. So this is, sometimes we'll see there's grids like this where they'll list without modifications and just check all the boxes. Here's a different one that I've seen. Again, they click without modifications. If they do click with modifications, obviously the X's need to be in a different spot. The modification should be listed in that same page. This is a separate document than everything else, right? So it's the district-wide assessments or statewide assessments. Make sure that your assessment, your accommodations that are being offered for these assessments, whether it's separate space or maybe they get earplugs or something, that also needs to then be reflected back to the prior pages about accommodations, modifications, and supports to make sure your document, your education program is fully, I guess, connected. All of the strings are connected between, this is our page of list of all the accommodations that are being offered. Well, that's great, but then, if we click on the statewide assessments that they do get to have accommodations and there's nothing listed here and there's nothing in my plan, then what are we doing? What are we offering that child to do in accommodation? So it's just to check on both of those. But all right, then of course, if you have your child on transition services, so they definitely needs to be at age 16. They can start at the 9th grade, right? Like we talked about, just preparing the student for life after high school. I have this example, it's kind of yellow. I don't know, hopefully you can see it. This is my transition service for this student that I got, and I have like nothing. It was improve career readiness by completing his work at school, organization, and task initiation. And all of that's fine. I mean, I have concerns about there not being a lot of other information on here, but we also need to make sure if this is what they're offering and everybody's okay with it, where are we actually documenting that this is going to happen? Is this going to be, a support role? Are we going to have it in the service grid that the special education director is going to help them with organization? Are they just, what's the plan? And how is this connected to the rest of our program? I do think that there needed to be more information here. Then we brought that up to the parent, obviously, because there's a lot of blank spaces here. Okay. I wanted just to take a note real quick on a personal learning plan. So it's called a PLP sometimes. It is a way to prepare students for success after high school. The IEP covers this. So if you have, this is a Minnesota statute for all students 9th grade and older. They're supposed to have a personal learning plan under Minnesota statute. Now the statute doesn't have a lot of enforcement behind it, but it is something that should be done for students. It says, of course, that students that have IEPs in place can just put their transition services or transition goals and work into their IEP. So this is not needed for a student with a disability that has an IEP. But if you have a student that is needing to work on their transition and maybe they're on a 504 plan or they're trying to get off an IEP for whatever reason, this is something that would be helpful for them. And the Minnesota rule is down here for folks, so you can see what's required and how to develop that plan and what's required to be in the plan. Okay. So we also need to have when services and modifications will begin, how often will be provided, how long they'll be in place. Often this is included in the service grid as well. Here's some accommodations, modifications, and supports that I've listed out as examples that I've seen. So we might have frequent teacher check-ins, self-directed short sensory breaks, adult support in the general education setting that would help the student. So we'll have student will have their daily assignments will be modified. So that will be included in this IEP that's required that all teachers for general education will have modified daily assignments for them. The student doesn't like to read out loud because it causes her anxiety. She will be not called on class to do that. And so we actually got that in an IEP because she really got stressed out every time she was called on to like do like a book report or read out loud to the class. And so in order to try to do testing or assessments for her, we tried to offer an alternative. You know, the teacher and the student can meet separately before class or after class to do whatever they needed to do for reading, but it didn't have to, you know, happen in class. So students allowed to retake assessments or complete test corrections until if she receives a lower score. So here's one. This is why I have district and state assessments may be taken in an alternative small setting. That's why I like to have them. If we have that document that has the setting or the testing being done with modifications in place, have it listed in the other sections as well to say that this is happening. Just because your program, you know, the paperwork is all interconnected, and it should be, right? And just to make sure that everything is listed in the right spot. When using redirection and use redirection and refocusing techniques, like it just has all these other options, excuse me, that you can kind of go through and add in these. A lot of these can also be put into a positive behavior support plan, which we'll go into in just a second, right? So we have our functional behavioral assessment that we kind of talked about earlier, and that can create a positive behavioral intervention plan or support plan. And that also should be part of your IEP as another document to consider, right? So we have our accommodations, modifications, and support. We have our district-wide assessments, service grid, you know, all our goals. We have our PLAF, right? We have all of these things. A positive behavioral intervention plan should be included in our educational program to make sure that our child's doing well. And our functional behavioral assessment information forms the creation of our positive intervention plan. That's why we need to have a good functional behavioral assessment in order to create this plan. Okay, so, all right, services must be in the IEP to be implemented, right? So here we had our identification, our evaluation, we qualify, we develop our IEP, and now we're at the IEP implementation. So we're actually gonna we got it done, parent has agreed to it, it's, you know, they signed the PW1 with a consent, and services are now gonna be started and implemented. At least once a year, the IEP should be reviewed to make sure the student is making academic progress. So that is one thing just to kind of keep in mind. It has to happen once a year. We can also have an IEP meeting at any point. An IEP meeting can review, the team can review any changes that they need to make throughout the year. Maybe they have a goal in there that's just way too difficult for the student and it's not like manageable at all. They can change that to a more manageable goal or more easily accessible goal, or maybe the goal's already been achieved and the student did well and they need to jump up to something next. And so that could be something that's added before this annual review. You don't have to wait, you know, a whole year while the child's like doing nothing. You can change things ahead of time. Okay, so your IEPs must be in effect at the beginning of every school year, right? So if you got it last year, it would be in place at the beginning of each school year. So if you transfer, that's this bottom one, if you transfer schools, the school must provide comparable services under FAPE, and they will offer those services until a new evaluation is conducted and the school develops, adopts, and implements a new IEP. And then if you meet to develop your IEP, right, you have to have your IEP when they determine that they do have, I'm sorry, when you do have a determination that there is a disability, they have to have the IEP drafted within 30 days. So it can still take a long time. That's why having a 504 plan can help bridge some of this gap. Okay, so 504 plans, this is our civil rights statute, right? That helps us make things easier for children that may not qualify for an IEP or that we're waiting for an IEP evaluation on. Or if we're trying to transition them away from an IEP for whatever reason and have them to a less restrictive, you know, special education setting for whatever, if we're trying to get them down to less needed services. There's lots of reasons that a 504 plan might make sense. There's this nice chart made by Pacer here. All right, so 504 plan is not an IEP. A student who does not qualify for an IEP may still qualify for a 504. So I'm gonna go back up real quick. Here, our chart, right? We have if our child doesn't qualify for after we have a comprehensive evaluation, or we have an initial evaluation and they say, oh, child doesn't qualify. So the child can then ask, or well, parent or whoever, guardian can ask for that 504 plan discussion if they hadn't already. So if they and while they're doing that, they would need to communicate that with the school, and they set up a meeting to discuss the 504 plan. Also, if they object to the comprehensive evaluation, just as a side note, comprehensive evaluation or the initial IEP evaluation that was done, if they object to that because they don't qualify, they can ask for the IEE at that point as well. So that's why this is down here again. But again, we will cover this at the series 4, just so folks are aware. Okay. All right, so it's similar to an IEP, this 504 plan, similar because it provides supports and accommodations, maybe time for testing and whatnot, but unlike an IEP, does not include goals and objectives. And the 504 plan basically requires that they do a evaluation in a timely manner to see if the student is needed to have services. The parent typically has to give permission for that to start, or should give permission for that to start. They're not always asked, but they should be giving permission to start that. The district, the school district, they try to identify and help kids. That's basically what this sentence is here, is that the district shall undertake and identify and locate children that are handicapped or needing help under the jurisdiction of their school. Okay, so in order to qualify for a 504 plan, they need to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, a record of such an impairment, or having been regarded as such an impairment. So I had a young girl who recently was placed with a family member, and they didn't have any medical records on her at all, or any information from anybody that did diagnoses on her. But we were aware enough about her situation that we were able to talk to the school and kind of talk about like what we know now and what the school is aware of now of her life circumstances is she's being regarded of having an impairment for having basically trauma history that impacted her ability to learn and function at school. And because we were able to navigate that, we could get the 504 plan in place. However, they were initially pushing just that we needed to have some sort of record or documentation from a doctor, but we didn't have that. So we made this other argument of being regarded of having such an impairment. Now, the impairment or the disability must limit the major life activities such as learning, thinking, reading, etc. You can read that here, but this is not a complete list, right? So if it impacts them in some other way that's impacting their school, right, then a 504 plan would be appropriate to remove barriers for them. So examples of accommodations could include preferential seating, having technology aids, maybe getting therapy, physical occupational therapy, behavioral management supports, things like that. All right, so that was a lot of information in a very short period of time. I will shut down my screen for a second. So maybe we can do questions first from Annabelle, and then.
So we actually didn't get any additional questions. Oh, I'm sorry. We have one additional question.
Okay.
If you know a child will need supports and they are going to start kindergarten, when do the assessments start?
Okay, can you say that one more time?
Sorry, if you know a child will need supports and they are going to start kindergarten, when do the assessments start?
So if there's not an IFSP, or I guess an IEP bridging from the birth to 3, then I would start a conversation with the teacher, maybe on the first day, and say, this is my concern and we need to have an evaluation now. And so that might be a conversation you might want to even start now. I know teachers are reaching out to kids' families, right? Because they're getting assigned. And so that might be something to consider currently and starting that process. But the process for the evaluation does take a long time, right? Because it's 30 school days from after you have that pre-evaluation meeting. So, but gathering information, just as a tip or suggestion, gathering information from other resources, providers, outside supports to bring to the school would be helpful in talking to the teachers. So at least they know how to work with the student while you're navigating the next steps. So,
Great.
okay.
So we actually do have, so there's another one that came in here. So at one point, I think, so you mentioned 60 days for an assessment, then 30 days. Can you clarify?
Yeah, so, okay, so the one slide is 60 days. Well, okay, so 60 days is what IDEA has underneath it, the federal law, right? It says 60 days has to be done. In Minnesota, it has 30 days from consent. So it's a little bit different on the language because it assumes it requires or permission. I think it says 30 days, 30 school days from permission. So I think that's in Minnesota, right? I guess I assume everybody here is from Minnesota, but in Minnesota, we require 30 days school days from permission to start that IEP evaluation or to complete it, sorry, to complete the IEP evaluation.
Okay. And there is one more. Can a district deny without a other health disability if there is no other disability identified?
Okay, can you say it one more time? Can they deny
Yeah.
another health disability?
Why don't you can go on to the other general questions you have, and I'm going to get clarification.
Okay. All right, I have one that came up. One of the major differences between IEP and 504 plan. So the major differences that I see between the IEP and 504 plan, IEP has a lot more requirements on having goals that are measurable and that make sense for the child. They have requirements of collecting data and showing progress on these goals, or these, the steps that the child is making for the IEP. You can also add the positive behavior support plan in there. And we'll go into, actually in the next couple of sessions, other protections that kind of go along with an IEP, whereas a 504 plan is just the plan. If the child doesn't progress when you have, testing outside of the general room, right? So that's the 504 plan. You have testing outside of the room, you have longer time on tests, but they're still not progressing. There's no like collection of data or changes that have to happen on the 504 plan. So that's the 504 plan is to help students that may not qualify for a IEP under the 13 categories, but then also it's a good, like I said before, it's a good bridge so we can at least get some supports in place for the child while we wait for the evaluation to be done. So yeah, but also there are some students that they just don't want to be on an IEP, right? And so that's a way to try to get them some help, even if they're like fighting the IEP process or services. So that's that. I made it so that people can unmute themselves if they want to jump in and ask questions, if you don't want to type. So anybody who has anything, or Annabelle, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I have, so can a district deny a child services if the parent doesn't have documentation of like an other health disability?
So the other health disability, let me pull up real quick here. They in Minnesota, my reading of the rule is that there has to have some sort of documentation. So the rule actually says ADHD or ADD or a written and signed document by a licensed physician of acute or chronic health condition. So yes, I think they can. So
Okay, and that was the only other one left in the
Okay.
chat. So if anybody else has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat now. Otherwise, if you want to unmute yourself, go ahead.
I did get a question that just came in about training. So there is something that can be added under one of the sections of the IEP. Typically, I see it near the accommodations, modifications, and support area. It might not necessarily fall within there, but maybe like a subsection kind of near there, where parents can ask for training. They can receive training on the child's disability, whatever that disability is. They can also require or ask that the school get training on certain diagnoses, on how to handle certain things with their child. So I've had parents that have requested that. Sometimes the schools, actually one school, they when we were talking about it, they offered to even send over the training materials that they were going to do with their staff on the particular disability. So that's something that can be added and included in an IEP. Okay, I have another one here. What to do when schools do not want to provide a para due to staffing? Yeah, so the staffing shortages and funding are not an excuse for not following an IEP. And so I would recommend that the parents sit down with the school, call an IEP team meeting and talk about what's going on, you know, the need for the para, the need for whatever staffing issue is not being fulfilled. Because if there's a list of priorities, maybe the parent has, you know, a concern about you know, more free time, like lunch and recess needs to be supervised, or the student really needs a para all the time because they have seizures and on a regular basis, and they just need to have more eyes on the child. Having a conversation about the priorities and why you need the staffing might at least lead the school to have a conversation about how they can accommodate that. I had a parent recently where we sat down actually at a mediation, and we talked about this need, right? And it was because she was able to express her concerns and why it was needed, we actually got it because we sat down and said, like, this is what we need and this is why. Then it was more successful for us to be able to get it rather than saying you need to do it. We offered at least some information on it. And then another thing is sometimes sitting down with the IEP team can help with brainstorming. So maybe they can't offer, you know, a pair all the time, but they can offer, you know, maybe the librarian can watch the child for an hour you know, at one time during the day, and then they can swap over to another staff if it really is a safety need or a need for the child. And so that might be just some ways to try to think about it. So, yeah. And then I just got another one here about, oh, okay, yeah. So someone just had noted, which is true, that having a medical diagnosis doesn't mean that you have an educational diagnosis, right? They're two separate things. So, and something that can be kind of surprising for folks or parents, right? So you might have a diagnosis of something, and the school is seeing something else. I have back in my prior life, when I was doing prosecution work, we had a child that was diagnosed with autism under her IEP, or, you know, had whatever autism spectrum disability, and it was not at all connected to anything out in her private life. It was all what the school had seen based on what they, you know, their testing and measures and whatnot. So a medical diagnosis and an educational diagnosis are not the same thing. And your disability needs to be impacting your education in order to have, you know, and lend itself into these disabilities here.
And we got another one in the chat too. Are there any specific policies or procedures for BIPOC families when it comes to IEPs and 504 plans?
I guess I don't know about policies and procedures per se about IEP plans. You can always talk about cultural concerns with the school. And if you know, I have a family where we're going to be asking that they have American Indian educator that's involved with the child. We're going to ask that they be included on the IEP team. So that's something to kind of consider. If there's I guess if there's concerns about like a communication style or that the school is being discriminatory, of course, document whatever you can to make sure that you are at least communicating the best you can and have record of what's being told to you. But I will think about that, and maybe we can, Annabelle, we can respond to that too in the email that goes out afterwards. But that's a really good question. So I got another one here. If you can ask for staff to be trained, can you ask for your child's peer to be trained at independence and supporting your child? So you can't have your IEP designed for other kids. We had this adorable little girl. She loves her friends so much. And so she was almost falling down the stairs to see them at the end of the day. And so we were talking about how to help her support her with her social skills. Of course, we cannot tell her peers what to do. We can do, the classroom, the general education classroom did like a sensory thing that kind of helped kids, I guess, understand a little bit better, or they tried to do it to make them understand a little bit better about autism and sensory needs. But we can't help them with the peer support that way, but we did try to help her on standing there with her para then. So then instead of, trying to fall down the stairs to get to her friends, that we're giving everybody high fives or, offering some sort of way to say goodbye to them. And that was something that we did in the IEP, not to try to like direct her, because we don't want to change. She's so excited to see her friends. We don't want to change that, but we wanted to make sure, one, she was safe. We don't want her to fall down the stairs. And two, we want to make sure that her peers and her friends are excited to see her as well. And obviously if you fall on somebody, we didn't want her to like lose friends because of that. So that was something that we did do, but we can't ask that other kids get trained on your child's disability. So, but you can talk to the general education teacher and see if they could provide books. I mean, that's stuff that they can do, but they can't like force like I don't know, like a PowerPoint training or something on the kids. So, Annabelle, any more questions on your side?
Sorry, nope, nothing at the moment.
Okay. All right. Okay, any other questions from anybody? You can unmute yourself if you'd rather just ask instead of type. Or you can send me an email. You all have my email now, so you can send me an email afterwards as well if you would rather do that. So, all right. Well, I have just a few more slides here and then I'll let you all go, I promise. So, oops. Well, that's what I was looking at. Let's get to the right slide. Okay, so I put on this PowerPoint just a couple links at the bottom of things that might be helpful for you going forward. Of course, but I hope to see you all next week. And next week will be much more interactive. We'll do more stuff, but I just wanted to make sure everybody had at least a foundation going forward. And we're going to talk about goals next week, which is going to be a mess, but it'll be fun, a fun mess. So anyways, here's some links that might be helpful for you. Department of Education has great resources. I send so many parents there, even if I'm working with them, just so that they have information themselves going forward. I don't work with families from birth to 12 years or 12th grade. That's too, often they're ready to go on their own. But the Department of Education has this great resources. PACER, like I mentioned before, great resources. I also plugged in the surrogate parent training here just because I thought that was helpful. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the future, but that's just an opportunity for if a parent is not involved, but they still have the rights to make the educational decisions, like how to navigate that. And then I've just some odd bunch persons that might be helpful. Okay, so Annabelle, you want to go here and you can talk about the last thing?
Yeah, we just wanted to thank you all for attending the first presentation of the 4-part education law training series. As a reminder, the entire series is going to be recorded and posted on YouTube, and we will send that out to all of you once those are posted. And otherwise, we hope to see you at our upcoming presentations.
Thank you very much.